Move along. Nobody wants to look at that.
Get a shot of this. Nobody's gonna believe it.
That's a waste of a good plate, sweetheart.
He's a person, same as you. Then it's my plate to waste.
She didn't know his name. She only knew he was hungry. What she didn't know, what nobody standing on that street knew, was that the man she'd just defended controlled more wealth than everyone there combined. That truth was still weeks away. For now, all she knew was that he was hungry, and that was enough. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Angela called while Denise was washing the dishes, the phone pinned between her shoulder and her ear, water running warm over her hands. She'd heard from a neighbor that her sister had been seen talking to that man outside the church again, and she didn't hide her irritation about it. She reminded Denise that people were starting to talk, that a single woman feeding a stranger on the street looked less like charity and more like desperation, especially to the kind of man their mother still hoped Denise might one day marry and settle down with properly. Denise didn't argue. She simply said the man had a name too, even if she hadn't asked what it was yet, and hung up before her sister could say anything else. She sat alone at her kitchen table afterward, the plate from dinner still drying in the rack, thinking not of Angela's words, but of the stranger's eyes, which never once asked her for anything beyond the food itself. At work the next morning, Denise moved through her rounds the way she always did, checking on patients who had no family to visit them, remembering the small details others forgot, how one man took his coffee, which nurse a frightened child trusted most, which elderly woman on the third floor liked her curtains left open no matter the weather outside. Her friend Ruth caught up with her near the supply closet and asked, only half joking, whether the rumors about the man on Maple Street were true. Denise admitted they were, and Ruth, instead of judging her the way half the building already seemed to be doing behind her back, simply said she wished more people in the world still had that kind of patience left in them. It was a small comment, but it was the first one all week that didn't come wrapped in a warning, and Denise held on to it longer than she expected to as she finished her rounds. Patricia stopped Denise in the hallway, only to remind her that the hospital's reputation depended on staff conducting themselves respectably outside of work hours too, phrasing it as a friendly reminder rather than a warning, though it didn't feel that way to Denise, standing there with a stack of charts in her arms. Denise didn't understand yet what Patricia meant exactly, but she nodded and kept moving, unaware that someone had already called the hospital's general line to report seeing her with the man from Maple Street, describing the encounter in far less generous terms than what had actually happened. Ruth, watching the exchange from a distance near the nurse's station, made a mental note to keep an eye on how Patricia handled the situation going forward, sensing something unfair already forming around her friend before it had even properly started to take shape. On the 7th evening, he finally spoke first. He told her his name was Marcus, nothing more, and thanked her for not asking questions the way everyone else did. Denise sat down beside him on the step, which she had never done before, smoothing her coat beneath her as she settled onto the cold concrete, and for the first time, they talked, not about his circumstances, but about ordinary things, the weather, the hospital, a song playing faintly from a passing car with its windows down. Deacon Frey, locking up the church for the night, nodded to both of them as he passed, having grown used to seeing Marcus there, but never before seeing anyone sit with him like that. What Denise didn't know was that the man beside her controlled more wealth than everyone on that street combined, and that he had chosen this corner, this coat, this hunger, on purpose, to find something money had never once been able to buy him. An older man named Tobias, who had lived along the same stretch of Maple Street for years, watched the two of them from a few doors down, leaning against the brick wall he'd claimed as his own spot, long before Marcus arrived, and later warned Marcus, in the plain way people who've seen a lot tend to speak, that a woman like that didn't come along twice in a man's life, disguise or no disguise. Marcus hadn't told Tobias the truth either, but Tobias seemed to sense there was more to the quiet stranger than he let on, and he kept the observation to himself the way he kept most things, having learned over the years that a man's secrets were his own business until he chose to share them with someone he trusted. Miles away, in a glass tower, Denise had never once had a reason to walk past. A small circle of employees continued running the daily business of Wade Holdings without their chairman, exactly as he had instructed a month earlier, the building humming along with its usual quiet efficiency. Harold, his closest aide, kept a private log of everyone who showed the disguised chairman kindness, a list that so far held only a handful of names out of the hundreds who passed him each week without a second glance. Nobody in that building knew where he slept at night, and nobody was permitted to ask, though Harold privately wondered, checking the calendar on his desk and the stack of decisions still awaiting a signature, how much longer his chairman intended to stay away from the empire waiting for him. The next morning, a coworker mentioned seeing Denise on the local community page. Someone had filmed her sitting with Marcus and posted it with a mocking caption about hospital workers who've lost their minds, the comments already filling with strangers eager to weigh in on a life they knew nothing about. Denise didn't check the comments. She had learned a long time ago that the people who mock kindness rarely understand it, and she wasn't going to let strangers online decide who she helped or why she chose to help them. Ruth deleted the post's link from the shared break room chat before Denise even had the chance to see how many people had shared it, muttering under her breath about people with nothing better to do than film a woman being decent to a stranger. Sharon raised the subject the moment Denise walked through the door, having seen the same video Angela had been forwarding around the family group chat all week, the phone practically burning a hole in her apron pocket by the time Denise arrived. She reminded Denise that a woman her age needed to think about her future, her reputation, and the kind of household she'd eventually build, the way she reminded her every few months whenever the subject of Denise's personal life came up uninvited at the dinner table. Denise reminded her mother gently that feeding a hungry man on her own time had nothing to do with any of that, and the dinner continued in an uneasy quiet neither of them chose to break, the clink of silverware filling the silence where conversation used to be. Marcus began testing her without her knowing it, mentioning small lies about his past, a failed job, a family that had turned away from him, a string of bad decisions he claimed to regret, to see whether her kindness would waver once his story sounded less like misfortune and more like consequence. It never did. Denise told him plainly that people don't always fall from grace through their own fault, and even when they do, that doesn't make them any less deserving of decency from the people around them. Marcus said little in response, but he remembered every word of it, and for the first time in years, he thought of Vivian Cross, the woman who had once promised to stand beside him and instead disappeared the moment his name was linked to a rumor of collapse, taking with her nearly everything he had believed about loyalty and love. Sharon invited a guest to the following Sunday dinner without telling Denise in advance. Gregory Voss, a businessman she'd met through a mutual acquaintance, known locally for his money and his confidence in equal measure, the kind of man who filled a room the moment he walked into it. Gregory spent the evening directing most of his attention toward Denise, praising her patience with the elderly and sick as though it were a quality he intended to acquire for himself rather than simply admire in her from across the table. Denise was polite, nothing more, and left the moment she reasonably could, aware that her mother had already begun forming an opinion about the evening that had nothing to do with what Denise actually wanted for her own life going forward. Denise brought Marcus a coat that had belonged to her father, Robert, the first time she'd given him anything beyond a meal, the wool still smelling faintly of the cedar closet it had hung in for years. She told him she didn't know much about his life before the street, and she wasn't asking him to explain it either. She only wanted him warm through the coming weeks, whatever his reasons for being there turned out to be. Marcus accepted the coat without a word, aware that the gesture cost her more than money ever could, because it came from a memory she rarely spoke about to anyone, and Tobias, watching from a distance, simply nodded to himself, as though something had been confirmed that he'd suspected for a while now. After the Sunday dinner, Gregory mentioned to a business associate, almost in passing over drinks, that he intended to look further into Denise's situation before committing any more time to courting her, unwilling to invest in a woman whose attention seemed to be elsewhere. The associate recommended a private investigator named Aldridge, known for discretion and thoroughness in equal measure, and Gregory filed the name away for later, telling himself it was simply due diligence, the same kind he applied to every deal he considered worth pursuing in his line of work. Deacon Frey began leaving an extra blanket near the church steps some nights, never commenting on it directly to Marcus, though the two of them exchanged enough quiet nods over the weeks that Marcus came to think of him as one of the few people on that street who asked nothing and expected nothing in return. When Denise mentioned once that she trusted the deacon's judgment about people more than almost anyone else she knew, Marcus filed the comment away, the same careful way Harold filed away every name on his growing list back at Wade Holdings, aware that trust, once given freely, was worth more than anything money could purchase. Alone in her kitchen that week, drying the same cup twice without noticing, Sharon found herself thinking of Robert, her late husband, and the modest, careful life they had built together without ever needing anyone else's approval to feel secure in it. She wondered, not for the first time, whether her fear for Denise's future was really about her daughter at all, or whether it was about her own quiet terror of watching another person she loved choose an uncertain path the way Robert once had, before it had eventually worked out for both of them against all her early doubts. By the end of the first month, Denise no longer thought of her evening visits to Maple Street as an errand of charity to be checked off before dinner. She looked forward to them the way she looked forward to little else in her week, timing her shifts and her walk home around the chance of seeing him there. Marcus, for all the wealth waiting for him back at Wade Holdings, found himself measuring his days by whether or not he'd see her before dark, a realization that unsettled him as much as it comforted him. Neither of them said as much to the other yet, but Tobias, watching them from his usual spot against the wall, had already stopped pretending not to notice. One evening, a sudden downpour caught Denise halfway to the church, and rather than turning back, she ran the rest of the way with her coat pulled over her head, arriving soaked but laughing for the first time in longer than she could remember. Marcus offered her the drier half of the church's overhang without a second thought, and they sat there together, watching the rain fall over Maple Street, neither of them in any hurry to see it stop. Tobias, tucked further under the awning with a knowing look on his face, remarked that he hadn't seen either of them smile like that in all his years on that corner, and neither Denise nor Marcus bothered to argue with him about it. Back at headquarters, Harold began to notice a change in the brief, coded messages his chairman sent each week to confirm he was safe. Where the earlier reports had been clipped and businesslike, they had grown warmer, longer, more curious about the ordinary details of a life Harold suspected his chairman had never expected to enjoy this much. Harold didn't mention it to anyone, but he began preparing two versions of the plan, waiting on his desk, one for a quiet, dignified end to the test, and one for whatever came after, should his chairman decide he wasn't ready to leave Maple Street behind so easily. Some nights, after Denise had gone home and the street had gone quiet, Marcus sat alone on the church steps, turning the coat she'd given him over in his hands, wondering how much longer he could keep pretending the test still mattered more than the woman it had been built to find. He had started this month telling himself he was searching for proof that kindness still existed somewhere in the world without a price tag attached to it. He hadn't expected to find someone whose kindness came with a cost of its own, one she was already paying at her job and in her own family's house, simply for choosing to be decent to him. 2 weeks after their first real conversation, Denise invited Marcus inside for a proper meal instead of a plate on the sidewalk, setting two places at her small kitchen table for the first time in longer than she cared to admit. She gave him a clean shirt, and while he ate, she noticed something she hadn't before, the way he carried himself, quiet but deliberate, like a man who had once made decisions for a living rather than simply endured them one day at a time. She didn't ask. She had decided a long time ago that a person's past wasn't a price of admission for her kindness, and she wasn't about to start charging it now, not after everything they'd already shared on those church steps. Ruth pulled Denise aside at work and admitted she'd overheard Patricia on the phone with someone from hospital administration discussing an ongoing situation involving a staff member's personal conduct, though Ruth couldn't make out enough of the call to know for certain who they meant by it. Ruth didn't have proof it was about Denise, but the timing worried her enough to say something rather than stay quiet, the way she normally would have, about hallway gossip that wasn't hers to repeat. Denise thanked her for the warning, though she wasn't sure yet what, if anything, she could do to protect herself from a complaint she hadn't even seen written down anywhere. Patricia called Denise in privately and told her, not unkindly but firmly, that the hospital board had received a complaint about her association with a known transient, and that continued attention could put her position at risk if it wasn't addressed quickly and quietly. Denise asked whether feeding a hungry man on her own time was truly a fireable offense, and Patricia had no clear answer beyond repeating that appearances mattered to people who funded the hospital's programs and sat on committees far above either of their pay grades. Denise left the office unsettled for the first time since this had all begun, not because she doubted her choice, but because she realized how much power other people's opinions held over her livelihood. Sharon sat Denise down alone this time, without Angela in the room, and admitted she was afraid. Afraid of gossip, afraid of Denise ending up alone, afraid of watching her daughter throw away stability for a stranger with nothing to offer in return for everything she was giving him. Denise told her mother she understood the fear, having watched Sharon carry the weight of raising 2 daughters alone after Robert passed without ever once complaining about it out loud, but that she wasn't willing to abandon someone simply because loving him carelessly would be easier than loving him carefully. Sharon didn't respond, but the conversation planted a seed of a plan she hadn't yet admitted to herself she was capable of carrying out. What Denise didn't know was that Angela had her own reasons for wanting the situation resolved quickly and quietly, reasons she hadn't shared with a single member of the family. A private debt she'd taken on the previous year had grown heavier than she'd let on to anyone, and a marriage between Denise and a man as wealthy as Gregory Voss looked, to Angela, like a problem that might quietly solve itself if she pushed hard enough in the right direction before anyone noticed how bad things had actually gotten. She told herself it wasn't selfish. She told herself it was practical, the same word she used every time she needed to justify something she already suspected was wrong. Gregory had done this before, though he never described it to himself in those terms. He preferred women who came to him already worn down by circumstance, whether financial or emotional, because gratitude was so much easier to secure than genuine affection, and easier still to mistake for love if a man didn't look too closely at the difference. Sharon's eagerness to see her daughter settled had struck him immediately as an opportunity rather than a courtesy, and he had spent the weeks since their introduction calculating exactly how much pressure Denise's family could be counted on to apply on his behalf without his ever having to ask for it directly. Gregory finally called Aldridge and hired him to quietly look into the man Denise had been seen with, giving him only a vague physical description and the name of the street where he'd been spotted more than once. Aldridge, a patient and methodical man by nature who took pride in never leaving a client unsatisfied, began his work slowly, starting with the church records and the local shelters, unaware that the trail he was following led toward one of the most carefully guarded secrets in the country, rather than the ordinary drifter he expected to find at the end of it. Marcus began confiding in Denise about the business failure he claimed had put him on the street, a story he had rehearsed carefully to protect his disguise, adding just enough detail to make it believable without making it too easy to verify. Denise never once flinched or pulled away from him during any of it. She told him that a failed business didn't erase a person's worth, and that she'd rather stand beside someone rebuilding than someone who had never been tested at all in their life. It was in that moment, watching her mean every word of it without hesitation, that Marcus understood he had found exactly what he came looking for, something Vivian Cross had never once offered him, even when his fortune was fully intact, and there had been nothing at all left to test between them. Tobias asked Marcus one evening, plainly and without much ceremony, settling onto the step beside him with the ease of a man who'd sat on that same concrete 1,000 times before, what he intended to do, once whatever test he was running, came to an end. Marcus hadn't told him the truth outright, but Tobias's question landed close enough to it that Marcus simply admitted he didn't know yet, that the closer he got to Denise, the harder it became to imagine explaining the lie at all, let alone forgiving himself for how long he'd let it run between them. Tobias told him the longer he waited, the heavier that explanation would get, and left it there, the way he always did when he'd said what needed saying and nothing more. On a crowded street corner one afternoon, a group of teenagers began filming Marcus and mocking him for spare change, circling him the way young people sometimes do when they mistake cruelty for entertainment worth capturing on their phones. And Denise happened to be walking past on her way home from an early shift. She stepped between them without hesitation, told the group plainly that mocking a struggling man said far more about their character than his, and stayed beside Marcus until they lost interest and walked away laughing among themselves at something else entirely. Marcus watched her defend a man the whole street believed was nothing, expecting nothing in return for it, and it confirmed everything Harold's private records had already suggested about the kind of woman she was. Back at Wade Holdings, Harold reported to an empty office chair out of habit before remembering his chairman wasn't there to hear it, a small, private ritual he'd developed over the weeks of running the company alone, and instead recorded the update in his private file. Of the 100 names gathered over the month-long test, Denise's remained the only one who had shown consistent, repeated kindness without ever once asking who the man on Maple Street really was underneath the coat. Harold began quietly preparing the paperwork such a discovery would eventually require, aware his chairman would need it sooner rather than later, given how quickly matters seemed to be developing. Aldridge reported back to Gregory with confusing news. The man matching the description had no identification on file anywhere in the city's shelter or benefits systems, no arrest record, no known address prior to appearing on Maple Street, as though he had simply materialized there a month earlier, with no history behind him at all. Gregory found the report unsatisfying rather than reassuring, tapping his pen against the desk as he read it twice over, and told Aldridge to keep digging, sensing something didn't add up about a supposedly homeless man who left absolutely no trace of ever having been poor in the first place. Alone one evening after another exhausting shift, Denise let herself imagine, just for a moment, how much simpler her life would be if she agreed to what her mother wanted, if she let Gregory's money smooth over every rough edge her family kept pointing to. The thought didn't last long. She pictured Marcus's face on the church steps, the quiet way he thanked her for things most people never noticed doing for him, and she understood that simplicity, bought at the cost of honesty, wasn't a trade she was willing to make, no matter how many people told her it was the sensible one. Angela and Sharon devised a plan, sitting together in Angela's parked car outside Denise's building long after the streetlights had come on. If Denise wouldn't distance herself from Marcus voluntarily, they would force the decision for her one way or another. Angela suggested spreading word of Marcus's presence to Gregory Voss directly, framing Denise as unstable and desperate, in the hope that Gregory would either withdraw his interest or take more forceful action to rescue her from the situation before it went any further than it already had. Sharon agreed, telling herself it was for Denise's own good, while Angela quietly hoped it would be enough to finally settle her own debts once and for all before anyone found out how deep they ran. Gregory received the news from Angela with more interest than either of them expected him to show. Rather than being discouraged, he saw an opportunity. A woman in Denise's position, pressured by her own family, would be easier to secure as a wife than one who felt entirely free to choose for herself without any outside pressure at all. He began quietly making arrangements of his own, contacting Sharon directly to propose a formal introduction ceremony, timed to happen before Denise could object with any real support behind her, and before Aldridge's investigation could complicate things further than they already were. Patricia called Denise in again, this time with a formal letter outlining a probationary period, citing conduct concerns that traced directly back to the video still circulating on the community page weeks after it should have been forgotten by anyone with better things to do. Denise asked who exactly had filed the complaint, and Patricia admitted she couldn't say, though Denise noticed the timing lined up closely with a call Angela had made to the hospital's general line the week before, a detail she filed away without saying a word out loud. She simply signed the paperwork and went back to her rounds, Ruth waiting for her outside the office with a coffee and no questions, which was exactly what Denise needed in that moment more than anything else. Denise told Marcus about the probation, without expecting him to fix anything, only because she had grown used to being honest with him about the cost of everything she was doing for his sake over the past weeks. Marcus asked if she regretted any of it. She said no, not once, because the people trying to punish her for kindness were the same people who would never understand why it mattered to her in the first place, no matter how she explained it to them. Marcus told her, for the first time, that she was the kind of person entire systems were built to overlook, and that the world owed people like her far more than it ever repaid them for their trouble. While Denise carried on unaware of any of it, the story shifted briefly to reveal the truth the audience had been waiting for since the very first scene. Marcus was not a man who had lost everything. He was the founder and chairman of Wade Holdings, one of the largest privately held companies in the country, and the disappearance from his own life had been deliberate, a test he had built himself, to find out who in this world still gave without expecting anything in return from the people they helped. Harold informed him that the month-long test was nearly complete, and that only a small number of people, Denise chief among them, had shown him real kindness without knowing who he truly was. Harold laid out everything his team had quietly gathered over the month, spreading the documents across the long conference table for his chairman to review. Records confirming Denise's unblemished work history at the hospital, her hospital's sudden and unexplained disciplinary action against her, and financial irregularities already surfacing in a routine background check run on Gregory Voss, whose name had come up twice in connection with a woman close to Marcus's chosen candidate. Marcus also learned, almost in passing, that someone had recently hired a private investigator to look into his own disguise, and told Harold to make sure that investigation quietly went nowhere until he was ready for it to matter. Aldridge came back to Gregory a second time, more frustrated than before, admitting that every lead he chased seemed to close itself off just as it started to matter, as though someone with far more resources than he had access to was quietly clearing the trail behind him every time he got close. Gregory, unwilling to accept a dead end after paying good money for answers, told Aldridge to keep the file open regardless, convinced that a man who could hide that thoroughly had to be hiding something worth knowing about before the wedding went any further. Gregory arrived with a formal proposal for Sharon, offering a marriage arrangement that included financial support for the family in exchange for a quick engagement to Denise, framed as generosity rather than the transaction it plainly was. Sharon accepted on Denise's behalf before her daughter even knew the conversation had taken place, telling herself that once Denise saw the security it offered, she would come to accept it in time, the way she had accepted so many hard things in her own life, without ever being asked first whether she wanted them. Gregory arrived unannounced at Denise's apartment, accompanied by Sharon, and demanded that Denise choose between him and the man from the street, once and for all, right there in her own kitchen. When Denise refused to be pressured, Sharon took drastic action. She seized Denise's phone from the counter and destroyed it in front of her, cutting off her only way to reach Marcus and warn him what was happening to her. Denise stood in her own kitchen, phone in pieces on the floor at her feet, and understood for the first time that her family saw her devotion as a problem to be solved rather than a choice to be respected. Marcus waited on the corner longer than usual that evening, the light fading around him as the street emptied out for the night, aware something had changed when Denise didn't appear at her normal time. Tobias noticed his unease and asked if something had gone wrong between them. Marcus resisted the urge to break his disguise early, reminding himself the test wasn't finished, though for the first time since it began, he questioned whether protecting the secret was worth the cost of leaving her to face her family's pressure without him beside her. With Denise unreachable and worry finally outweighing caution, Ruth took it upon herself to walk past Maple Street on her way home from an evening shift, having heard enough from Denise over the past weeks to recognize Marcus on sight the moment she saw him. She told him plainly that Denise's family had taken her phone and were pushing her toward a marriage she didn't want, and that whatever kind of man he really was underneath that coat, now was the time to show it clearly. It was Ruth, without knowing any of the truth about who he really was, who finally gave Marcus the push he needed to stop waiting any longer than he already had. Patricia called Denise into her office one final time and informed her she was being suspended pending a formal review, citing continued complaints and now, absurdly, A rumor that Denise had been spending hospital time on personal matters. A claim with no basis Patricia herself seemed uncomfortable defending out loud to Denise's face. Denise didn't argue. She collected her things quietly, aware that her family's interference had now cost her the one steady thing she had left, besides the man waiting for her on Maple Street. Alone that night, without her phone, without her job, and without any clear way to reach the one person who had made the past month bearable, despite everything else falling apart around her, Denise allowed herself, briefly, to wonder whether her mother was right, whether kindness without caution really was a kind of foolishness after all. She thought of her father, Robert, and the quiet, stubborn way he'd once told her that doing right by people rarely felt convenient at the time it mattered most, and she decided, sitting alone in her kitchen with the broken phone still on the counter, that she would rather be foolish in that direction than wise in the other one. Marcus told Harold it was time, calling from a payphone near the church, because he had no phone of his own to use for the disguise to hold. Whatever the paperwork still required, whatever remained unfinished in the plan they'd been quietly building over the past month, he wasn't waiting another day to make sure Denise knew the truth, and knew she wasn't facing her family's pressure alone anymore. Harold, who had been waiting for this instruction for longer than he let on to anyone, simply nodded on his end of the line and began making the calls that would end the disguise for good. With Denise cut off from any way to reach Marcus, and now suspended from work, Sharon and Gregory arranged a public gathering at the house, inviting neighbors and extended family under the pretense of a celebration, decorating the living room with more care than the occasion honestly deserved. They intended to announce an engagement between Denise and Gregory before she could object in front of witnesses, gathered specifically to make refusal feel impossible. Denise arrived to find the house already full of guests, and understood immediately that she had been maneuvered into a corner meant to make refusal look like an embarrassment to her whole family in front of everyone they knew. Gregory stood before the gathered guests and began speaking as though the matter were already settled, listing the gifts and arrangements he intended to provide with the practiced confidence of a man used to getting exactly what he wanted, prompting a wave of approval from relatives eager to see the family's fortunes improve overnight. Denise stood silent at the edge of the room, aware that speaking up now would be framed by her own mother as ingratitude in front of everyone watching, and yet unwilling to let a lie stand, simply because a room full of people wanted so badly to believe it was true. Denise finally spoke, her voice steady, despite every eye in the room turning toward her at once, telling the room plainly that she had never agreed to marry Gregory Voss, that her mother had made the decision without her, and that no amount of money changed the fact that she did not love him and would not be pressured into pretending otherwise for anyone's comfort. Sharon tried to interrupt, insisting Denise was simply frightened and would come to her senses given enough time, but Denise held her ground in front of everyone, repeating that her life was not a debt to be settled on her family's behalf, no matter how the room reacted to hearing it. Just as the room fell into an uncomfortable silence, unsure how to respond to what they'd just witnessed, the sound of engines interrupted everything. A line of vehicles pulling up outside the house, far beyond anything the neighborhood had ever seen before on that quiet street. Harold stepped out first, followed by members of Marcus's staff, all of them addressing him the same way the moment he appeared. Chairman. The crowd that had gathered to watch Denise's humiliation fell silent all at once, recognizing the same man they had mocked and filmed on Maple Street weeks earlier, now dressed exactly as who he truly was underneath the coat. The relatives and neighbors who moments earlier had been nodding along with Gregory's announcement now stood frozen near the walls of Sharon's living room, unsure whether to stay or slip quietly out the front door before anyone noticed them. A few pulled out their phones, less to mock this time and more out of sheer disbelief, recording the same man they'd laughed at weeks earlier, now standing in a room full of people who owed him their silence. Word would reach the local community page again within the hour, though this time the caption underneath the footage would read nothing like the one that had humiliated Denise a month before. Angela was the first to understand, her face draining of color as she remembered filming him for the community page weeks before, with a mocking caption she now wished she could take back. Sharon stared at the same man she had once called a stranger with nothing to offer her daughter, now standing in her living room, surrounded by a staff who treated his every word as instruction, without hesitation. Denise said nothing. She simply looked at Marcus, searching his face for the truth of everything he had never told her across all those quiet evenings on the church steps. Marcus addressed the room directly, his voice calm despite the weight of what he was finally saying out loud, explaining the disguise, the month spent on the street, and the small number of people who had shown him genuine kindness, expecting nothing back from him in return. He turned to Denise specifically and told her the deception had never been about her. It had been about finding someone exactly like her, and that he was sorry it had taken this long, and this much of her life, to finally tell her the truth she deserved from the start. He mentioned Tobias by name too, promising the old man would never spend another winter on that street if he didn't want to, and Deacon Frey's small kindnesses hadn't gone unnoticed either. Marcus turned to Gregory next, revealing that his staff had already uncovered financial irregularities tied to Gregory's business dealings during their background review of everyone connected to Denise's life over the past month. He added that the matter had been handed to the appropriate authorities before he'd even arrived at the house that evening, and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he was fully aware of Aldridge's investigation too, noting dryly that hiring someone to dig into a man's past didn't typically end well for people with as much to hide as Gregory clearly did. Gregory's protests meant nothing once two officers stepped forward to escort him out of the house in front of everyone. Sharon tried to explain herself, insisting everything she had done was to protect her daughter's future the only way she knew how. Marcus didn't raise his voice at her. He simply told her that protecting someone and controlling them were not the same thing, and that Denise had never needed saving from the man she'd chosen to be kind to of her own free will. Sharon had no answer, and for the first time in the story, she said nothing at all, thinking, perhaps, of Robert, and what he might have said if he'd been there to see what she'd been willing to do. Angela admitted, quietly, and without anyone forcing her to say it out loud, that she had been the one to encourage Gregory's plan, and had hoped a wealthy marriage might ease a debt she'd never told her family about until this exact moment. Denise had suspected some of it already, but hearing Angela say it plainly, in front of everyone gathered in her mother's living room, was harder than she expected it to be. Marcus said nothing about it, beyond telling Angela that the debt itself wasn't the problem. The choice to use her own sister to solve it had been. Before leaving, Marcus mentioned one more matter to Harold in front of the room, his tone as even as it had been all evening. A hospital that had suspended one of its most reliable employees over baseless rumors, funded in part by a private foundation Wade Holdings quietly supported behind the scenes. Within days, Patricia would find herself explaining to the hospital board why she had disciplined an employee with an unblemished record based on second-hand gossip and an anonymous complaint that traced back to Denise's own sister. Patricia's position would not survive the review, and Ruth would be the one to tell Denise the news over the phone, unable to keep the satisfaction entirely out of her voice as she said it. The relatives who had come dressed for a celebration left in a slow, uncertain trickle, none of them quite sure how to say goodbye to a woman they had just watched be vindicated in front of the very people who doubted her. A few offered quiet, awkward congratulations on their way out the door, the same people who an hour earlier had nodded along with Gregory's announcement without a second thought. Sharon stood by the window watching the cars pull away one by one, aware that the house would never quite feel the same after tonight, no matter how carefully she tried to put it back in order. Once the guests had gone, and the house had emptied out, leaving only the quiet aftermath of everything that had just happened, Marcus asked Denise for a few minutes alone, away from the noise. He told her the full truth of why he'd started the test in the first place. Vivian Cross, the woman who had once promised to marry him and vanished the moment his name was linked to financial trouble, and how her absence had convinced him, wrongly, that no one in the world gave without expecting something back eventually. Denise didn't respond with anger at the comparison. She simply told him that whatever Vivian had failed to give him, it had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with the kind of person Vivian had chosen to be when it mattered most. Marcus turned to Denise, in front of everyone who had once mocked her for kindness, and told her that everything he had built meant nothing if he couldn't share it with the one person who had treated him with dignity when she believed he had nothing at all to offer her in return. He asked her to marry him, not as an apology for the disguise, but as the truest offer he had ever made in his life, to anyone, at any point. Denise said yes, on the condition that he never lie to her again, and he agreed without hesitation, meaning it more than he'd meant anything in years. In the weeks that followed, Angela came to Denise alone, without Sharon beside her, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, and admitted for the first time that she had been the one to file the complaint at the hospital, driven by embarrassment and her own hidden debt, rather than genuine concern for the family's name. Denise didn't forgive her immediately, but she didn't turn her away either, telling her sister that real change would have to be shown over time rather than spoken once and forgotten the next morning. Marcus, without telling Denise beforehand, quietly arranged for Angela's debt to be settled through an anonymous hospital-adjacent charity fund. Around the same time, Tobias moved off Maple Street into a small apartment paid for through the same foundation, and showed up to the wedding in a suit Denise had picked out for him herself, insisting he sit close enough to the front that everyone would know exactly who he was to both of them. Denise no longer worked under Patricia's replacement at the hospital, though she still visited Maple Street from time to time, now carrying meals for others the way she once had for Marcus, Ruth walking beside her, more often than not on quiet evenings after their shifts ended. Deacon Frey still left an extra blanket by the church steps some nights, though there was rarely anyone left there needing it anymore, since the foundation had begun its work. Sharon attended the wedding quieter than before, having learned in the hardest way possible that kindness is never wasted on the wrong person, only misunderstood by the people too afraid to practice it themselves. Gregory's name never surfaced in the family's conversations again after that night. Marcus asked Denise in the quiet months after the wedding what she wanted to do with a portion of the fortune she'd married into, half expecting her to hesitate, the way people often did when handed more than they knew what to do with. She didn't hesitate at all. She asked him to help her start a small fund in her father's name, one that covered hospital costs for families who couldn't afford them, and quietly supported anyone the system had a habit of overlooking the way it had once overlooked her. Marcus agreed before she'd even finished explaining it, and the Robert Fund, as she chose to call it, began its work within the year, helping people who would never know the disguised billionaire's name, only the kindness that had somehow found its way to them. Wealth doesn't reveal a person's character, struggle does. Denise never once asked Marcus for anything, and in the end, that was the only thing that made her worthy of everything he had built and everything he had left to give. If you believe kindness still matters, even when no one's watching, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next story.